The morning mist clung to the shores of Crete like a divine veil, slowly lifting to reveal the emerald jewel of the Mediterranean. It was the year 2800 BCE, and the island pulsed with an energy that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath the feet of its inhabitants. The Neolithic farmers who had called this land home for generations were about to witness something extraordinary, the birth of Europe's first great civilization. Callisthenes stood at the edge of what would one day become the great port of Heraklion, watching as foreign vessels approached the harbor. Their sails bore symbols he had never seen before, and their hulls were laden with goods that glinted like captured starlight in the Mediterranean sun. The young man's weathered hands, calloused from years of working the fertile soil, trembled slightly as he recognized that this moment would change everything. The ships that arrived that morning came from distant Anatolia, their crews speaking in melodious tongues that danced on the sea breeze. They brought with them not just pottery and precious metals but something far more valuable: ideas. The captain of the lead vessel, a man named Theron whose eyes held the wisdom of countless voyages, stepped onto the sandy shore and looked around with the calculating gaze of someone who recognized potential. "This island," he murmured to his lieutenant, "sits at the heart of the world's greatest sea lanes. From here one could reach Egypt in a week, Anatolia in 3 days, and the Greek mainland before the next new moon." His words carried the weight of prophecy, though he could not have known how thoroughly they would be fulfilled. The Cretan villagers gathered around the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They had traded with passing merchants before, but these visitors seemed different, more purposeful, more visionary. Among the locals, an elderly woman named Rhea stepped forward. Her hair, white as the foam on breaking waves, caught the morning light as she spoke in the ancient tongue of the island. "Welcome, sea wanderers," she said, her voice carrying the authority of one who had served as the village's spiritual guide for decades. "What brings you to our shores in such numbers?" Theron's interpreter, a young man who had learned the Cretan dialect during previous voyages, translated the woman's words. The captain smiled, recognizing in her bearing the wisdom that often accompanied age in these ancient communities. "We come seeking not just trade but partnership," he replied through his interpreter. "Your island stands at the crossroads of the world. Together we could build something magnificent, a civilization that would make the very gods take notice." As the days passed, the seeds of transformation were planted. The Anatolian traders shared their knowledge of advanced pottery techniques, showing the Cretan artisans how to create vessels so thin they seemed to glow when held to the light. They demonstrated new methods of metalworking, turning copper and tin into bronze implements that were both beautiful and functional. Most importantly, they brought with them the concept of organized maritime trade, the idea that the sea was not a barrier but a highway to prosperity. Callisthenes found himself drawn to these newcomers, spending long hours listening to their stories of distant lands and exotic peoples. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, he sat beside Theron on the beach, watching dolphins play in the surf. "Tell me," the young Cretan said, "what do you see when you look at our island?" Theron was quiet for a long moment, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. The mountains rose like sleeping giants in the distance, their peaks touched with golden light. Olive groves cascaded down the hillsides like green waterfalls, and the fields of grain swayed in the evening breeze. But it was the harbors that truly caught his attention, the natural coves and inlets that provided perfect shelter for vessels from across the known world. "I see the future," he said finally. "Your people have the soil to feed a great civilization, the harbors to welcome the world, and the wisdom to blend the old ways with the new. But most importantly, you have something that cannot be bought or conquered. You have the spirit of the sea itself. The transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded like a flower blooming in slow motion, each petal representing a new aspect of the emerging Minoan culture. The scattered farming communities began to coalesce around natural harbors, drawn by the increasing maritime activity. Local chieftains, recognizing the economic potential of their positions, began to organize more sophisticated trading networks. Among these early leaders was a man named Asterios, whose name would echo through the centuries in myth and legend. He was a natural diplomat, equally comfortable negotiating with Egyptian merchants and Anatolian craftsmen. His compound, built on a hill overlooking the northern coast, became the first of what would eventually evolve into the great palace complexes of Minoan civilization. The architectural innovations began simply enough. The Anatolians showed the Cretans how to build with stone rather than mud brick, creating structures that could withstand the occasional earthquake that shook the island. They introduced the concept of the light well, an open courtyard that brought sunshine and fresh air into the heart of a building. These seemingly minor improvements would eventually blossom into the magnificent palaces that would define Minoan civilization. As the communities grew and prospered, so too did their artistic expression. The pottery that had once been purely functional began to take on decorative elements. Marine motifs appeared on vessels: octopi with gracefully curving tentacles, dolphins leaping through stylized waves, and fish swimming in eternal circles around ceramic bowls. These designs reflected the islanders' growing connection to the sea that was bringing them such prosperity. The influence of the newcomers extended beyond mere technique to philosophy and worldview. The Anatolians brought with them a more sophisticated understanding of trade and diplomacy, concepts that the Cretans adapted to their own cultural framework. They learned to see themselves not as isolated islanders but as participants in a vast network of exchange that connected all the peoples of the Mediterranean. This shift in perspective was perhaps most evident in the religious practices that began to emerge. The ancient Cretan reverence for the earth goddess began to incorporate elements from the various cultures that now frequented their shores. The goddess took on new attributes, becoming not just the provider of harvest bounty but the protector of sailors and the patron of craftsmen. Her worship began to reflect the cosmopolitan nature of the emerging civilization. The sacred caves that had long served as places of worship were enhanced with new rituals and offerings. Pilgrims began to arrive from distant lands, drawn by growing tales of the island's spiritual power. These visitors brought with them their own religious ideas, which were absorbed and transformed by the Cretan priestesses who maintained the ancient traditions. One of the most significant developments was the emergence of what scholars would later call the Minoan genius for synthesis. Rather than simply adopting foreign ideas wholesale, the Cretans had a remarkable ability to take the best elements from various cultures and weave them into something uniquely their own. This talent would become one of the defining characteristics of their civilization. The textile industry, for example, began to flourish as merchants brought new dyes and weaving techniques from across the Mediterranean. Cretan weavers learned to create fabrics that were prized from Egypt to Anatolia, but they did so while maintaining their own distinctive aesthetic. The flowing lines and natural motifs that characterized Minoan art began to appear in the patterns of their textiles, creating a visual language that was unmistakably their own. As the first century of transformation drew to a close, the island had become unrecognizable from its earlier incarnation. Where once there had been scattered farming villages, now there were thriving port cities connected by well-maintained roads. The population had grown dramatically, swelled by immigrants from across the Mediterranean who came seeking opportunity in this new land of promise. The children who had been born during these early years of change grew up bilingual, equally comfortable speaking the ancient Cretan tongue and the various trade languages that had become necessary for commerce. They developed a unique worldview that was both deeply rooted in the island's traditions and remarkably cosmopolitan in its outlook. Young Callisthenes, now a mature man with sons of his own, often reflected on the changes he had witnessed. He had seen his island transform from a quiet backwater into a hub of international activity. The ships that now crowded the harbors came from places he had never imagined in his youth. Egypt with its golden treasures, the Levant with its purple dyes, and the mysterious lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Yet despite all the changes, something essentially Cretan remained. The deep connection to the natural world, the reverence for the divine feminine, and the fundamental sense of harmony that had characterized the island's culture for millennia continued to influence every aspect of life. The Minoans were creating something unprecedented, a civilization that was simultaneously ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, insular and cosmopolitan. As the sun set on this transformative century, the stage was set for even greater developments. The wealth accumulated through trade was beginning to enable more ambitious projects. The local leaders were consolidating their power and dreaming of grander monuments. The artistic traditions were evolving toward new heights of sophistication. And deep in the sacred caves of Mount Ida, the priests and priestesses were receiving visions that would shape the religious life of the civilization for centuries to come. The Minoan Enigma was beginning to unfold, and the world would never be the same. The small island in the Mediterranean had become the birthplace of Europe's first great civilization, a beacon of culture and commerce that would influence the development of Western civilization for millennia to come. The awakening was complete, and the true adventure was about to begin. The year was 2500 BCE. And the settlement that would become the great palace of Knossos was experiencing its first major transformation. What had begun as a modest complex of buildings surrounding a natural spring had evolved into something far more ambitious. A sacred center that would define the spiritual heart of Minoan civilization for over a millennium. Ariadne, a young priestess barely 18 summers old, stood in the central courtyard of the emerging palace complex, watching as master builders from across the Mediterranean directed the placement of massive stone blocks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flagstones, and the air was thick with the sounds of construction. The ring of metal on stone, the creaking of wooden cranes, and the rhythmic chanting of workers coordinating their efforts. The vision for this sacred space had come to her predecessor, the elderly high priestess Pasiphae, in a dream so vivid that she had awakened with tears streaming down her face. In the dream, she had seen a great bull emerging from the earth itself, its horns gleaming like polished bronze, its eyes holding the wisdom of the ages. The bull had spoken to her in a voice like distant thunder, commanding her to build a palace that would serve as a bridge between the earthly realm and the divine. The labyrinth must be more than stone and mortar, Pasiphae had explained to the young Ariadne as they walked through the construction site. It must be a living symbol of the sacred mysteries, a place where the divine and mortal worlds can meet and merge. The concept of the labyrinth was not new to Cretan culture. For generations, the island's sacred dances had followed intricate patterns that spiraled inward toward a central point, symbolizing the journey of the soul toward divine truth. But the physical manifestation of this spiritual concept in stone and bronze was something entirely unprecedented. The master architect, a brilliant man named Daedalus who had come to Crete from the Greek mainland, had spent months studying the island's spiritual traditions before beginning his work. He understood that this was not merely a building project but a sacred undertaking that would require the highest levels of both technical skill and spiritual insight. The passages must flow like water, he explained to his team of craftsmen, carrying visitors inevitably toward the center, but by a path that is neither straight nor predictable. Each turn must reveal new wonders, new mysteries, new opportunities for contemplation and revelation. The construction itself was a marvel of engineering. The Minoans had developed techniques for moving massive stones using a combination of ramps, levers, and coordinated human effort that would not be seen again until the great pyramid builders of Egypt. But more impressive than the physical achievement was the spiritual vision that guided every decision. The walls of the labyrinth were adorned with frescoes that told the story of the island's mythology in vivid detail. Skilled artists, many of whom had come from as far away as Syria and Egypt, worked side by side with local craftsmen to create images that seemed to pulse with life. The famous bull-leaping fresco, which would become one of the most recognizable images of Minoan art, was painted during this period by a master whose name has been lost to history but whose genius has endured for millennia. The religious significance of the bull in Minoan culture was profound and multifaceted. The animal represented not just raw power and fertility but also the untamed forces of nature that could be channeled through proper ritual and understanding. The bull-leaping ceremony, which took place in the central courtyard of the palace, was both a religious ritual and a test of courage that symbolized humanity's relationship with the divine. Young men and women from across the island came to Knossos to participate in these ceremonies. They underwent months of training, learning not just the physical skills required to vault over the charging bull but also the spiritual preparation necessary to approach the sacred animal with the proper reverence and understanding. Theseus, a young man from a prominent family in the northern part of the island, had arrived at Knossos that spring with dreams of glory and spiritual enlightenment. Tall and athletic, with the dark hair and bronze skin typical of the Minoan nobility, he possessed the physical gifts necessary for bull leaping but struggled with the spiritual aspects of the training. "You approach the bull with your mind," his instructor, an elderly priest named Minos, told him during one particularly frustrating training session. "But the bull can only be understood with the heart. You must learn to feel its spirit, to anticipate its movements not through calculation but through empathy." The training took place in a series of chambers beneath the palace, where young bulls were kept and carefully tended by specialist priests. These animals were not mere livestock but sacred beings, fed on the finest grains and herbs, their horns polished to a mirror shine, their every need attended to with religious devotion. The underground chambers themselves were a marvel of construction. Ventilation shafts brought fresh air from the surface, while an ingenious system of drains ensured that the spaces remained clean and dry. The walls were painted with murals depicting the eternal dance between human and bull, a visual reminder of the sacred nature of the training taking place within. As Theseus progressed in his training, he began to understand the deeper mysteries of the bull cult. The animal represented the masculine principle in nature, powerful, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous, but also capable of great beauty and nobility when properly understood. The female principle was represented by the Earth Mother, the goddess who was worshipped in the sacred caves of Mount Ida and whose influence permeated every aspect of Minoan life. The bull leaping ceremony itself was the symbolic union of these two principles. The leaper, whether male or female, became a bridge between earth and sky, between the mortal and divine realms. The moment of contact with the bull was said to be a form of communion with the gods themselves, a transcendent experience that could transform the participant in profound ways. Ariadne, as a priestess, served as one of the guardians of these mysteries. She had never participated in the bull leaping itself, that was reserved for those called to a different form of service. But she understood its significance perhaps better than anyone. She had spent years studying the ancient texts, learning the songs and prayers that accompanied the rituals, and developing the intuitive understanding necessary to guide others on their spiritual journey. The palace complex continued to grow throughout this period, with new wings and chambers added to accommodate the increasing numbers of pilgrims and participants who came to Knossos. The famous throne room, with its griffin frescoes and stone seat that may have been the original model for all subsequent European thrones, was completed during this time. The throne itself was carved from a single block of limestone, its surface polished to a lustrous sheen and inlaid with precious stones from across the Mediterranean. But it was not merely a seat of political power, it was a spiritual focal point, a place where the earthly ruler could commune with the divine forces that governed the island. King Minos, the legendary ruler whose name would become synonymous with Minoan civilization, was said to have received his authority directly from Zeus himself. According to the myths that were already beginning to form around his reign, he would retreat to a sacred cave on Mount Ida every 9 years to receive new laws and guidance from the king of the gods. The relationship between the divine and earthly realms was particularly complex in Minoan culture. Unlike many ancient civilizations where the gods were seen as distant and often hostile forces, the Minoans maintained a sense of intimate connection with the divine. Their gods were not abstract principles but living presences who could be encountered through proper ritual and spiritual practice. The goddess culture that dominated Minoan religion was particularly sophisticated in its understanding of the feminine divine. The Earth Mother was not simply a fertility goddess but a complex figure who embodied wisdom, compassion, and the nurturing power of nature. Her worship involved elaborate ceremonies that took place in natural settings, caves, mountaintops, and sacred groves, as well as in the constructed spaces of the palace. The famous snake goddess figurines, which were created during this period, represented one aspect of this divine feminine. The snakes were symbols of rebirth and transformation, representing the goddess's power to bring renewal and healing. The bare-breasted figure holding the serpents was not erotic but sacred, representing the life-giving power of the divine feminine. The artistic achievements of this period were extraordinary. The Minoans developed techniques for creating frescoes that seemed to glow with inner light, using minerals and pigments that created colors of unprecedented brilliance and permanence. The famous Prince of the Lilies fresco, with its graceful figure moving through a field of flowers, exemplified the Minoan genius for combining naturalistic observation with spiritual symbolism. The pottery of this period also reached new heights of sophistication. The characteristic kamars ware, with its delicate forms and intricate decorations, was prized throughout the Mediterranean. These vessels were not merely functional objects but works of art that reflected the Minoan understanding of beauty as a form of divine expression. The influence of the Knossos palace began to spread throughout the island and beyond. Other settlements began to construct their own palace complexes, each adapted to local conditions but all reflecting the basic principles that had been established at Knossos. The palaces at Malea, Phaistos, and Zakros each had their own character and specializations, but all were united by the common thread of Minoan's spiritual and artistic vision. The trade networks that had been established during the previous century continued to expand and become more sophisticated. Minoan merchants were now welcome in ports throughout the Mediterranean, their goods prized for their quality and beauty. But more than mere commerce, these trade relationships facilitated the exchange of ideas and cultural practices that enriched Minoan civilization. The palace workshops at Knossos became centers of innovation and artistic excellence. Master craftsmen from across the known world came to learn from the Minoans, while Minoan techniques and styles began to influence art and architecture from Egypt to Anatolia. The distinctive Minoan aesthetic, characterized by flowing lines, natural motifs, and a sense of joyful celebration of life, began to appear in contexts far from Crete. The religious festivals that took place at Knossos during this period were spectacular affairs that attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean. The bull-leaping ceremonies were the centerpiece of these celebrations, but they were surrounded by a rich tapestry of other rituals, performances, and communal activities. The festival of the sacred marriage, held each year at the spring equinox, was particularly significant. This ceremony celebrated the union of the Sky Father and Earth Mother, the cosmic forces whose interaction brought life and fertility to the world. The ritual involved elaborate processions, sacred dances, and offerings that connected the participants to the fundamental rhythms of nature. Music played a crucial role in these ceremonies. The Minoans had developed a sophisticated musical tradition that incorporated instruments from across the Mediterranean. These vessels were not merely functional objects but works of art that reflected the Minoan understanding of beauty as a form of divine expression. The influence of the Knossos palace began to spread throughout the island and beyond. Other settlements began to construct their own palace complexes, each adapted to local conditions but all reflecting the basic principles that had been established at Knossos. The palaces at Malea, Phaistos, and Zakros each had their own character and specializations, but all were united by the common thread of Minoan's spiritual and artistic vision. The trade networks that had been established during the previous century continued to expand and become more sophisticated. Minoan merchants were now welcome in ports throughout the Mediterranean, their goods prized for their quality and beauty. But more than mere commerce, these trade relationships facilitated the exchange of ideas and cultural practices that enriched Minoan civilization. The palace workshops at Knossos became centers of innovation and artistic excellence. Master craftsmen from across the known world came to learn from the Minoans, while Minoan techniques and styles began to influence art and architecture from Egypt to Anatolia. The distinctive Minoan aesthetic, characterized by flowing lines, natural motifs, and a sense of joyful celebration of life, began to appear in contexts far from Crete. The religious festivals that took place at Knossos during this period were spectacular affairs that attracted visitors from across the Mediterranean. The bull-leaping ceremonies were the centerpiece of these celebrations, but they were surrounded by a rich tapestry of other rituals, performances, and communal activities. The festival of the sacred marriage, held each year at the spring equinox, was particularly significant. This ceremony celebrated the union of the Sky Father and Earth Mother, the cosmic forces whose interaction brought life and fertility to the world. The ritual involved elaborate processions, sacred dances, and offerings that connected the participants to the fundamental rhythms of nature. Music played a crucial role in these ceremonies. The Minoans had developed a sophisticated musical tradition that incorporated instruments from across the Mediterranean. The distinctive double-headed drums, ceremonial horns, and stringed instruments created soundscapes that were said to facilitate communication with the divine. As the sun set on this golden age of Minoan civilization, the palace of Knossos stood as a testament to humanity's ability to create beauty and meaning in the world. The labyrinth that had begun as a spiritual vision had become a physical reality that would inspire wonder and mystery for millennia to come. The sacred bulls that had emerged from the earth in dreams had become living symbols of the divine power that flowed through all creation. The young priestess Ariadne, now a mature woman with her own students and responsibilities, often stood in the central courtyard of the completed palace and marveled at what had been achieved. The complex that surrounded her was more than a building. It was a living embodiment of the Minoan understanding of the sacred, a place where the divine and mortal worlds could meet and merge in an eternal dance of creation and transformation. The year was 2200 BCE, and the great harbor of Knossos buzzed with activity as merchant ships from across the Mediterranean converged on the Minoan capital. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the harbor's crystal-clear waters, where vessels of every size and origin bobbed at anchor like exotic sea birds resting on their long journeys. Captain Nikolaos stood on the deck of his flagship, the Dolphin's Dream, surveying the bustling scene with the practiced eye of a man who had spent the better part of his 40 years navigating the wine-dark sea. His weathered face, bronzed by decades of sun and salt air, bore the confident expression of one who had helped build the most extensive trading network the ancient world had ever known. The ship beneath his feet was a marvel of Minoan maritime engineering. Unlike the crude vessels of earlier centuries, the Dolphin's Dream was sleek and graceful, her hull designed with mathematical precision to cut through waves with minimal resistance. The distinctive curved bow, shaped like a dolphin's snout, was both aesthetically pleasing and functionally superior, allowing the vessel to maintain stability in rough seas while achieving remarkable speed. The technological innovations that made such ships possible had been developed over generations of Minoan seafarers. The use of cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon provided a lightweight yet durable construction material, while the distinctive scarlet sails, woven from the finest Minoan textiles, could catch the slightest breeze and propel the vessel forward with grace and efficiency. But it was not just the ships themselves that made the Minoan trading network so successful. It was the sophisticated understanding of navigation, weather patterns, and commercial practices that the island's merchants had developed. Nikolaos carried with him charts that were marvels of precision, showing not just the locations of harbors and hazards but also the seasonal patterns of winds and currents that could make the difference between a profitable voyage and a disaster. The harbor itself was a testament to Minoan engineering prowess. Massive stone breakwaters protected the anchorage from the fierce storms that could sweep across the Mediterranean with little warning. The quays were constructed of carefully fitted limestone blocks, their surfaces polished smooth by generations of use. Bronze rings set into the stone provided secure moorings for even the largest vessels, while a system of cranes and pulleys allowed for the efficient loading and unloading of cargo. The young scribe Alexios stood at the harbormaster's office, carefully recording the arrival of each vessel in the detailed logs that were the foundation of Minoan commercial success. His reed pen moved swiftly across the papyrus, noting the ship's origin, cargo, and crew in the flowing script that had evolved from the mysterious Linear A writing system. "The golden ibis from Memphis," he called out to his assistant, carrying 30 amphora of the finest Egyptian wine, 20 talents of gold, and a consignment of ivory from the Upper Nile. The cargo represented wealth beyond the dreams of most ancient peoples, yet it was merely one of dozens of such shipments that arrived at Knossos each day. The commercial revolution that had transformed Crete into the Mediterranean's premier trading hub had its roots in the island's unique geographical position. Located at the crossroads of three continents, Crete could serve as a natural entrepot for goods flowing between Egypt, Anatolia, and the emerging civilizations of the Greek mainland. But geography alone could not explain the Minoan success. It was their genius for organization, innovation, and diplomacy that truly set them apart. The palace workshops at Knossos had become centers of manufacturing excellence, producing goods that were prized throughout the known world. The famous Minoan pottery, with its distinctive marine motifs and sophisticated glazing techniques, was so highly valued that fragments have been found in sites from Britain to Mesopotamia. The skilled artisans who created these works were supported by a complex system of apprenticeship and guild organization that ensured the highest standards of quality and craftsmanship. Demetrios, the master potter whose workshop occupied a prime location near the palace, was considered one of the greatest artists of his age. His specialization in the creation of elaborate ceremonial vessels had made him wealthy beyond measure, but it was his innovations in glazing techniques that truly set him apart. The distinctive lustrous finish of his pottery was achieved through a closely guarded process that involved multiple firings and the use of rare minerals imported from as far away as Afghanistan. "The secret," he would tell his most promising apprentices, "is not in the clay or the fire, but in understanding the spirit of the piece. Each vessel must be allowed to find its own form, its own voice. We are not creating objects. We are giving birth to beings that will carry the essence of Crete to the far corners of the world." The export of Minoan pottery was just one aspect of a trade network that encompassed virtually every luxury product known to the ancient world. Minoan merchants dealt in Egyptian gold, Mesopotamian lapis lazuli, Baltic amber, and precious stones from India. They traded Spanish silver for Cypriot copper, Syrian cedar for Anatolian textiles, and African ivory for Northern European tin. The complexity of these trading relationships required a sophisticated understanding of international diplomacy and commercial law. The Minoans had developed standardized weights and measures that were recognized throughout the Mediterranean, making it possible to conduct business with confidence across vast distances. Their contracts, inscribed on clay tablets in Linear A script, specified not just the terms of individual transactions but also the procedures for resolving disputes and ensuring fair dealing. As the sun set over the harbor of Knossos, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Captain Nikolaos prepared for another voyage. The Dolphin's Dream had been loaded with the finest products of Minoan craftsmanship: pottery, textiles, bronze implements, and precious jewelry. Her destination was the mysterious lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where strange peoples were said to possess metals and stones unknown to the civilized world. The success of the Minoan trading network had created a level of prosperity and cultural sophistication that was unprecedented in the ancient world. The island had become a beacon of civilization, attracting merchants, artisans, and scholars from across the known world. The wine-dark sea, once a barrier between peoples, had become a highway connecting diverse cultures in a web of mutual benefit and understanding. The traders of Crete had accomplished something remarkable. They had created the world's first truly global economy, one based not on conquest and exploitation but on mutual benefit and shared prosperity. Their legacy would endure long after their ships had disappeared from the Mediterranean, inspiring future generations of merchants and explorers to seek wealth through wisdom rather than warfare. The merchant princes who controlled these trade networks lived in magnificent villas that dotted the Cretan countryside. These country estates, with their elaborate gardens and sophisticated water systems, represented a new form of aristocratic culture that was based on commercial success rather than military conquest. The owners of these properties were not warriors but entrepreneurs, men and women who had built their fortunes through intelligence, hard work, and an understanding of the global economy. Lysander, whose villa overlooked the harbor of Knossos from its perch on a nearby hill, was typical of this new class of merchant nobility. His great-grandfather had been a simple farmer, but through 3 generations of shrewd business decisions and careful reinvestment, the family had built a trading empire that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the Black Sea. The villa itself was a marvel of Minoan domestic architecture. The central courtyard, with its dolphin fountain and colorful frescoes, provided a cool refuge from the Mediterranean heat. The private apartments were decorated with artistic treasures from across the known world: Syrian ivories, Egyptian faience, and Mesopotamian cylinder seals. But it was the wine cellar that truly demonstrated the owner's wealth and sophistication. The cellar contained amphora of wine from every major producing region of the ancient world. There were light, fragrant wines from the Greek islands, rich, dark vintages from the hills of Anatolia, and the legendary sweet wines of Egypt that were said to have been blessed by the gods themselves. The collection represented not just personal pleasure but also commercial acumen. Many of these wines would appreciate in value over time, making the cellar as much an investment as a source of enjoyment. The social gatherings that took place in these merchant villas were legendary throughout the Mediterranean. Guests would arrive from across the known world to enjoy the hospitality of the Minoan elite, participating in elaborate banquets that featured delicacies from every corner of the ancient world. These events were not merely social occasions but also business opportunities, where deals worth fortunes were negotiated over cups of wine and plates of delicacies. The entertainment at these gatherings reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Minoan society. Musicians from Egypt would perform alongside dancers from Anatolia, while storytellers from the Greek mainland would recount tales of gods and heroes. The famous Minoan bull-leaping performers were always popular attractions, their death-defying acrobatics serving as a reminder of the courage and skill that characterized the island's culture. The role of women in Minoan commercial society was remarkably progressive for the ancient world. Female merchants, while less common than their male counterparts, were not unknown, and some had achieved considerable success and influence. The famous priestess merchant Ariadne the Younger had built a trading empire that specialized in religious artifacts and ceremonial objects, supplying temples and shrines throughout the Mediterranean with the sacred implements of their rituals. The ship Sacred Serpent, which Ariadne had commissioned from the finest shipwrights in Crete, was a floating temple as much as a commercial vessel. Its holds contained not just trade goods but also portable shrines, ceremonial costumes, and the sacred implements needed for the religious ceremonies that were an integral part of ancient commercial life. Every major business transaction was accompanied by ritual observances, and success in trade was seen as a sign of divine favor. The religious aspects of Minoan commerce were particularly sophisticated. The goddess who protected traders and merchants was known as Dictina, the Lady of the Nets, who was said to guide vessels safely through dangerous waters and ensure fair dealing in all commercial transactions. Her shrines were found in every major port, and no merchant vessel would depart without appropriate offerings and prayers. The festival of Dictina, celebrated each summer at the height of the trading season, was one of the most spectacular events in the Minoan calendar. Hundreds of vessels would converge on Knossos, their crews participating in elaborate processions and ceremonies that honored the goddess and blessed the coming year's trading ventures. The harbor would be filled with ships of every description, their colorful sails and banners creating a tapestry of color against the blue waters of the Mediterranean. The economic impact of these trading networks extended far beyond the immediate benefits to Minoan society. The wealth generated by commerce allowed for unprecedented investments in art, architecture, and technology. The great palaces of Crete were built with profits from trade, and the skilled craftsmen who created the masterpieces of Minoan art were supported by the patronage of wealthy merchants. The technological innovations that characterized Minoan civilization were also largely driven by commercial needs. The development of standardized weights and measures, the creation of sophisticated accounting systems, and the invention of new navigation techniques all emerged from the practical requirements of long-distance trade. The Minoans were not just consumers of foreign goods but also innovators who constantly sought to improve the efficiency and profitability of their operations. The influence of Minoan traders extended far beyond the immediate sphere of commerce. As they traveled throughout the Mediterranean, they carried with them not just goods but also ideas, artistic styles, and technological innovations. The distinctive Minoan aesthetic began to appear in contexts far from Crete, while foreign influences were absorbed and transformed by the island's remarkably adaptable culture. The diplomatic relationships that were necessary to maintain these trading networks also contributed to the relative peace and stability that characterized the Minoan world. The year was 2000 BCE, and the island of Crete had reached the zenith of its power and influence. Yet beneath the glittering surface of commercial success and artistic achievement, a deeper current flowed, one that connected the Minoans to the most ancient mysteries of their sacred island. In the limestone caves that honeycomb the mountains of Crete, a spiritual tradition as old as humanity itself continued to flourish, guiding the civilization's understanding of life, death, and the eternal dance between the mortal and divine realms. High Priestess Rhea descended into the Idaean cave, her white robes flowing like moonlight in the flickering glow of oil lamps. The cave, sacred to the Earth Mother since time immemorial, had become the spiritual heart of Minoan civilization. Here, according to legend, the infant Zeus had been hidden from his father Cronos, nurtured by the milk of the goat Amalthea and protected by the Curetes, whose ritual dances drowned out the child's cries. The cave itself was a natural cathedral, its vast chambers adorned with stalactites and stalagmites that had been shaped by millennia of patient water action. The Minoans had enhanced these natural formations with careful arrangements of sacred objects, bronze double axes, ceramic vessels filled with offerings, and mysterious figurines that seemed to pulse with inner life in the lamplight. "The cave remembers everything," Rhea whispered to her young acolyte Melissa, as they made their way deeper into the sacred depths. "Every prayer, every offering, every moment of divine communion that has taken place here is preserved in the stone itself. We are not just worshippers. We are participants in an eternal ceremony that began with the first humans to shelter in these depths." The religious practices that took place in the sacred caves were far more complex and sophisticated than the simple earth goddess worship that characterized earlier periods. Over the centuries, the Minoans had developed an intricate theology that incorporated elements from across the Mediterranean world, creating a unique synthesis that was both deeply rooted in local tradition and remarkably cosmopolitan in its outlook. The central figure in this religious system was the great goddess, known by many names but always recognized by her essential attributes. She was the Earth Mother, the giver of life and the receiver of the dead. She was the Lady of the Beasts, who ruled over all wild creatures and ensured the fertility of the land. She was the Mistress of the Sea, who protected sailors and blessed their voyages. But perhaps most importantly, she was the keeper of the mysteries, the divine force that initiated worthy souls into the deeper truths of existence. The initiation ceremonies that took place in the sacred caves were among the most closely guarded secrets of Minoan civilization. Only those who had demonstrated the proper spiritual preparation and commitment were allowed to participate in these ancient rites. The process of selection was rigorous, involving not just spiritual aptitude but also the ability to maintain absolute secrecy about what was revealed during the ceremonies. Young Theokritos, son of a prominent merchant family from the palace of Malea, had been chosen for initiation after years of preparation. His training had begun in childhood with the memorization of sacred songs and the learning of ritual dances. As he grew older, he had studied the ancient texts, learned to interpret the symbolic language of dreams and visions, and developed the mental discipline necessary to undergo the transformative experiences that awaited him in the cave. The preparation for initiation involved a period of fasting, purification, and meditation that lasted for an entire lunar month. The candidate was required to abstain from all luxuries, eating only simple foods and sleeping on the ground. Daily ritual baths in the sacred springs that fed the cave system were mandatory, as were periods of contemplation in which the initiate sought to empty his mind of all worldly concerns. The ceremony itself began at sunset on the night of the new moon, when the darkness was most complete and the veil between the worlds was thinnest. The candidate, wearing only a simple white tunic, was led blindfolded into the depths of the cave by the priests and priestesses who would guide him through the ancient mysteries. The first chamber of the initiation was dedicated to the element of earth. Here the candidate was required to lie in a shallow pit filled with soil from the sacred groves of the goddess, symbolically returning to the womb of the Earth Mother. The experience was meant to induce a state of profound relaxation and receptivity, preparing the mind for the revelations that would follow. The priests began to chant in the ancient language of the island, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the cave. The sound was hypnotic, creating a trance-like state in which the boundary between self and environment began to dissolve. The candidate felt himself sinking into the earth, becoming one with the eternal cycles of growth, death, and rebirth that governed all existence. The second chamber was dedicated to the element of water. Here, a natural pool fed by an underground spring created a mirror-like surface that reflected the lamplight in dancing patterns. The candidate was required to enter the pool and remain submerged for as long as possible, experiencing the sensation of dissolution and renewal that water symbolized. The water was surprisingly warm, heated by the earth's inner fire, and rich with minerals that were said to have healing properties. As the candidate floated in the sacred pool, he experienced visions of the goddess in her aspect as the Lady of the Waters. She appeared as a figure of transcendent beauty, her long hair flowing like seaweed, her eyes holding the depths of the ocean itself. The third chamber was dedicated to the element of air. Here the candidate was required to climb a natural chimney in the rock, ascending toward an opening that allowed fresh air to circulate through the cave system. The climb was difficult and dangerous, requiring both physical courage and spiritual determination. It symbolized the soul's journey toward enlightenment, the difficult ascent from the darkness of ignorance to the light of understanding. At the top of the chimney, the candidate emerged into a small chamber where the night sky was visible through a natural opening in the rock. The stars seemed impossibly bright and close, as if the climber had ascended to the very threshold of the divine realm. Here the goddess appeared in her aspect as the Lady of the Sky, her form outlined in starlight, her voice speaking the secrets of the cosmos. The fourth and final chamber was dedicated to the element of fire. Here a natural gas seepage created an eternal flame that had burned continuously for thousands of years. The candidate was required to pass through the flame, experiencing the purifying and transformative power of fire. The experience was both terrifying and exhilarating, symbolizing the death of the old self and the birth of the new. The flame itself was not hot enough to cause physical harm, but its psychological effect was profound. The candidate experienced a sense of complete transformation, as if every cell in his body had been purified and renewed. The goddess appeared in her most awesome aspect, surrounded by flames that seemed to dance with their own intelligence, her voice proclaiming the deepest mysteries of existence. The revelations that were given during these initiation ceremonies were never recorded in writing, but their influence on Minoan civilization was profound and lasting. The initiates returned to the world with a transformed understanding of their place in the cosmic order, and their wisdom influenced every aspect of Minoan culture from art and architecture to politics and commerce. The sacred caves also served as oracles, places where the goddess could communicate with her people through specially trained priestesses. These oracles were consulted on matters of great importance, from the timing of planting and harvesting to the conduct of diplomatic negotiations. The process of consultation was elaborate and formal, requiring specific offerings and ritual preparations. The most famous of these oracles was the Pythia of Crete, a priestess who served in the Dictaean cave on the eastern part of the island. Her prophecies were renowned throughout the Mediterranean world for their accuracy and insight. Kings and merchants from across the known world would journey to Crete to seek her counsel, bringing rich gifts and offerings in hopes of receiving favorable pronouncements. The oracle would enter a trance state induced by the inhalation of natural gases that seeped from cracks in the cave floor. These gases, which modern science has identified as ethylene and other psychoactive compounds, created an altered state of consciousness in which the priestess could receive visions and communications from the divine realm. Her pronouncements were interpreted by trained priests who translated her ecstatic utterances into practical guidance for the consultants. The influence of the cave mysteries extended far beyond the realm of religion into the practical governance of Minoan society. The priest-kings who ruled the various palaces were all initiates of the mysteries, and their political decisions were guided by the wisdom they had received during their spiritual training. This created a form of theocracy that was remarkably effective and stable, combining spiritual authority with practical governance. The legal system of the Minoans was also influenced by the mysteries. The concept of divine justice, in which the goddess herself was the ultimate judge of right and wrong, created a moral framework that emphasized harmony and balance rather than punishment and retribution. Disputes were resolved through ritual processes that sought to restore cosmic order rather than simply determine guilt or innocence. The artistic traditions of the Minoans were deeply influenced by the imagery and symbolism of the cave mysteries. The famous snake goddess figurines, with their complex iconography of serpents, birds, and sacred symbols, were visual representations of the mysteries that could only be fully understood by those who had undergone initiation. The elaborate frescoes that adorned the palaces often contained hidden meanings that were accessible only to the initiated. The mystery religions of Crete also had a profound influence on the island's approach to death and the afterlife. The Minoans developed sophisticated burial practices that reflected their understanding of death as a transformation rather than an ending. The elaborate tomb complexes that have been discovered throughout the island were designed to facilitate the soul's journey to the otherworld, providing the deceased with the spiritual tools necessary for continued existence. The famous Minoan burial practice of placing the dead in large ceramic vessels, known as larnaques, was directly related to the cave mysteries. The vessels were decorated with symbolic imagery that was meant to guide the soul through the various stages of its otherworldly journey. The practice reflected the Minoan belief that death was simply another form of initiation, a passage from one state of existence to another. The seasonal festivals that were celebrated throughout the Minoan world were also connected to the mysteries of the sacred caves. The spring fertility festivals, which celebrated the return of the goddess from the underworld, involved elaborate processions to the cave entrances, where offerings were made and prayers were recited. The autumn festivals, which marked the goddess's descent into the underworld, involved similar ceremonies that prepared the community for the dark months ahead. The most important of these festivals was the Great Mysteries, celebrated every 9 years at the sacred cave of Psychro. This ceremony involved initiates from across the Minoan world, who gathered to participate in elaborate rituals that renewed their spiritual connection to the divine. The festival lasted for 9 days and nights, with each day dedicated to a different aspect of the goddess and her mysteries. The influence of the Minoan mysteries extended far beyond the island itself. Traders and diplomats who had been initiated into the mysteries carried their spiritual understanding to distant lands, where it influenced the development of mystery religions throughout the Mediterranean world. The Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, the Isis mysteries of Egypt, and the Mithraic mysteries of the Roman Empire all show evidence of Minoan influence. The cave mysteries also played a crucial role in the development of Minoan medicine and healing practices. The sacred caves were seen as places of healing, where the goddess could cure both physical and spiritual ailments. The priests and priestesses who served in these caves developed sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine, psychological healing, and the connections between spiritual and physical well-being. The medical papyri that have been discovered in Minoan contexts show evidence of remarkably advanced understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and therapeutic techniques. The healing practices combined practical knowledge with spiritual insight, creating a holistic approach to health that treated the whole person rather than just the symptoms of disease. As the golden age of Minoan civilization reached its peak, the sacred caves remained the spiritual heart of the culture. The mysteries that were celebrated in these ancient sanctuaries provided the Minoans with a profound understanding of their place in the cosmic order, a wisdom that influenced every aspect of their remarkable civilization. The caves had become more than simply places of worship. They were gateways to the divine, portals through which the eternal mysteries of existence could be glimpsed and understood. The legacy of the cave mysteries would endure long after the fall of Minoan civilization, influencing the development of religious thought throughout the ancient world. The wisdom that was preserved in these sacred depths would continue to inspire seekers of truth for millennia to come. a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to transcend the limitations of mortality and glimpse the eternal truths that lie hidden beneath the surface of existence. The year was 1800 BCE, and in the archives of the palace at Knossos, the most important work of the Minoan civilization was being carried out by a dedicated group of scribes whose contributions to human knowledge would endure for millennia. The script they used, which modern scholars would later call Linear A, was more than a mere writing system. It was the repository of Minoan wisdom, the key to understanding one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations. Master scribe Asterios sat at his writing table in the palace scriptorium, carefully forming the elegant symbols that would record the day's transactions, religious observations, and administrative decisions. His reed stylus moved with practiced precision across the clay tablet, each stroke deliberate and meaningful. The morning light streaming through the light well above illuminated the intricate characters that seemed to dance across the surface of the clay. The scriptorium itself was a marvel of organization and efficiency. Tall shelves lined the walls, holding thousands of clay tablets arranged by subject matter and date. The air was thick with the earthy smell of wet clay and the faint aroma of the olive oil that fueled the lamps during the long hours of night work. Young scribes sat at smaller tables, copying important documents and practicing their calligraphy under the watchful eyes of their masters. The Linear A script that Asterios and his colleagues used was a sophisticated writing system that had evolved over centuries from the earlier pictographic scripts of the island. Unlike the simple picture writing of earlier civilizations, Linear A was a syllabic script that could express complex ideas and abstract concepts with remarkable precision. Each symbol represented a specific sound or syllable, allowing the scribes to record not just concrete objects and numbers but also the subtle nuances of Minoan language and thought. The development of this writing system had been driven by the practical needs of Minoan commerce and administration. As the island's trading network expanded and its society became more complex, the need for accurate record-keeping became paramount. The early pictographic scripts, while adequate for simple inventories and basic transactions, proved inadequate for the sophisticated requirements of a complex civilization. The breakthrough had come during the reign of King Minos III, when a brilliant scribe named Daedalus the Younger had systematized the various symbols and sounds that were already in use throughout the island. Working with a team of scholars and linguists, he had created a standardized script that could be used consistently across all the Minoan territories. The result was a writing system that was both elegant and practical, capable of recording everything from religious rituals to commercial contracts with equal facility. The tablets that filled the palace archives contained a remarkable record of Minoan civilization. There were inventories of goods stored in the palace magazines, listing everything from olive oil and wine to precious metals and exotic spices. Trade agreements with foreign merchants detailed the terms of complex commercial relationships that spanned the Mediterranean. Religious texts recorded the sacred rituals and mythological stories that formed the spiritual foundation of Minoan culture. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Linear A archive was the collection of tablets that dealt with the island's diplomatic relationships. These documents revealed the sophisticated international relations that the Minoans had developed with other Mediterranean civilizations. There were treaties with Egyptian pharaohs, trade agreements with Mesopotamian city-states, and diplomatic correspondence with the emerging Mycenaean kingdoms of the Greek mainland. The young scribe Melanthios, who specialized in diplomatic correspondence, was working on a particularly important tablet that contained a message from the court of the Hittite king. The document dealt with a complex territorial dispute that had arisen over trading rights in the eastern Mediterranean. The careful diplomatic language required precise translation, and Melanthios worked slowly and deliberately to ensure that every nuance was captured correctly. The process of creating these clay tablets was itself a complex art. The clay had to be prepared to exactly the right consistency. Too wet and the stylus would create blurred marks, too dry and the tablet would crack. The scribes used a special mixture of fine clay and organic materials that created a durable surface capable of preserving the writing for centuries. Once the text was complete, the tablets were carefully dried and then fired in kilns to create a permanent record. The most precious tablets in the archive were those that dealt with the religious mysteries of the island. These sacred texts, written in a special ceremonial version of Linear A, contain the hymns, prayers, and ritual instructions that were used in the worship of the great goddess. Access to these tablets was strictly controlled, and only the highest-ranking priests and priestesses were allowed to read them. The religious tablets revealed the sophisticated theological thinking that underlay Minoan civilization. The scribes had recorded not just the practical aspects of religious observance but also the deep philosophical questions that had occupied Minoan thinkers for generations. There were treatises on the nature of the divine, meditations on the relationship between the mortal and immortal realms, and complex theological arguments about the proper interpretation of sacred symbols and rituals. The mathematical tablets in the archive demonstrated the advanced understanding of numbers and calculation that the Minoans had developed. The scribes had created a sophisticated system of numerical notation that could handle complex calculations involving trade, taxation, and architectural planning. The most promising students were eventually chosen for advanced training in the specialized scripts and technical knowledge required for different types of record-keeping. The scribal schools that were attached to the major palaces were centers of learning that attracted students from across the Mediterranean world. Foreign scholars came to study Minoan writing and administration, while Minoan scribes traveled abroad to learn the writing systems and administrative practices of other civilizations. This intellectual exchange contributed to the cosmopolitan character of Minoan culture and helped to spread Minoan influence throughout the ancient world. The preservation of the Linear A tablets was a major concern for the palace administration. The archives were carefully organized and maintained, with elaborate systems for cataloging and storing the thousands of documents. Special chambers were constructed with controlled temperature and humidity to ensure the long-term preservation of the clay tablets. The most important documents were copied multiple times and stored in different locations to prevent loss. The legacy of the Linear A scribes extended far beyond the immediate needs of Minoan administration. Their work preserved the intellectual and cultural achievements of one of humanity's most remarkable civilizations, creating a record that would inspire and inform future generations. The sophisticated writing system they developed influenced the development of other scripts throughout the Mediterranean world, contributing to the spread of literacy and the preservation of human knowledge. As the golden age of Minoan civilization reached its peak, the scribes continued their vital work of recording and preserving the achievements of their remarkable culture. The tablets they created would survive the fall of the palaces and the decline of Minoan power, serving as a testament to the intellectual achievements of Europe's first great civilization. The mysteries of Linear A would challenge and inspire scholars for millennia to come, a fitting legacy for the scribes who had dedicated their lives to the preservation of human knowledge and wisdom. The tablets contained geometric formulas, astronomical observations, and mathematical principles that would not be rediscovered in Europe for centuries. The architectural tablets were particularly fascinating, containing detailed plans and specifications for the great palaces and public buildings that defined Minoan civilization. These documents revealed the sophisticated engineering knowledge that had made possible the construction of multi-story buildings with complex plumbing systems, advanced ventilation, and earthquake-resistant foundations. The scribes had recorded not just the basic dimensions and materials but also the subtle aesthetic principles that gave Minoan architecture its distinctive character. The legal tablets provided insight into the sophisticated system of justice that governed Minoan society. The scribes had recorded not just the laws themselves but also the reasoning behind them and the principles of interpretation that judges used in applying them. The legal system that emerged from these records was remarkably progressive, emphasizing restoration and reconciliation rather than punishment and retribution. The medical tablets revealed the advanced understanding of health and healing that Minoan physicians had developed. The scribes had recorded detailed descriptions of diseases, treatments, and surgical procedures that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and physiology. The medical texts combined practical knowledge with spiritual insight, reflecting the Minoan belief that health was a matter of harmony between the physical and spiritual aspects of existence. The artistic tablets contained detailed instructions for the creation of the frescoes, sculptures, and decorative objects that adorned the palaces. These documents revealed the sophisticated aesthetic theories that guided Minoan artists and the complex symbolic meanings that were embedded in their works. The scribes had recorded not just the technical aspects of artistic creation but also the spiritual significance of the images and symbols that filled Minoan art. The educational tablets provided insight into the sophisticated system of learning that prepared young Minoans for their roles in society. The scribes had recorded curricula for different types of education, from the basic literacy and numeracy required for commerce to the advanced philosophical and theological studies necessary for religious leadership. The educational system that emerged from these records was remarkably comprehensive, emphasizing both practical skills and spiritual development. The agricultural tablets contained detailed records of farming techniques, crop yields, and seasonal observations that demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of agriculture that sustained Minoan civilization. The scribes had recorded not just the practical aspects of farming but also the religious rituals and seasonal festivals that connected agricultural work to the spiritual life of the community. The technological tablets revealed the advanced understanding of craftsmanship and manufacturing that made Minoan goods so prized throughout the Mediterranean. The scribes had recorded detailed instructions for metalworking, pottery making, textile production, and other crafts that required specialized knowledge and skills. These documents preserved the trade secrets and technical innovations that gave Minoan craftsmen their competitive advantage in international markets. The historical tablets provided a chronological record of important events in Minoan civilization, from the reigns of kings to natural disasters to significant cultural developments. These documents revealed the sophisticated understanding of history and chronology that Minoan scholars had developed, including complex systems of dating and historical interpretation. The astronomical tablets contained detailed observations of celestial movements and their significance for both practical and religious purposes. The scribes had recorded not just the positions of stars and planets but also the complex calendrical systems that governed both agricultural and religious life. The astronomical knowledge preserved in these tablets was remarkably advanced, including accurate predictions of eclipses and other celestial events. The philosophical tablets revealed the sophisticated intellectual life that flourished in Minoan civilization. The scribes had recorded the thoughts and debates of Minoan philosophers on questions of ethics, metaphysics, and the nature of reality. These documents demonstrated the high level of abstract thinking that characterized Minoan intellectual culture. The archive also contained numerous tablets that dealt with the practical administration of the palace complex itself. These documents revealed the sophisticated bureaucratic system that managed the vast economic and social enterprise that the palace represented. There were work schedules for the hundreds of craftsmen and laborers who worked in the palace, inventory records for the massive storerooms that held the wealth of the kingdom, and detailed accounts of the religious ceremonies and festivals that marked the passage of the seasons. The scribes who maintained these records were not merely clerks but scholars and intellectuals who played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting Minoan culture. Their work required not just technical skill in writing but also deep knowledge of law, religion, history, and the natural world. The best scribes were highly respected members of society, often serving as advisors to kings and priests. The training of scribes was a long and demanding process that began in childhood. Young candidates were selected based on their intelligence, dedication, and family background. They began their studies with basic literacy and numeracy, gradually progressing to more specialized subjects as they demonstrated their abilities.